What unfolds when a cherished Hollywood star finds herself in direct conflict with one of daytime television's most outspoken personalities is the kind of moment viewers talk about for months. The encounter between Julia Roberts and Joy Behar quickly turned into one of the most discussed segments of the year, a clash that no one in the studio seemed fully prepared for. What began as a simple promotional visit soon spiraled into an uncomfortable exchange that shifted the atmosphere from friendly to electric within minutes. The mood in the studio grew tense the instant Julia stepped onto the set. She was there to introduce her newest project, an emotional story centered on working mothers struggling to juggle professional responsibilities with family life. It was supposed to be a warm and predictable conversation, the sort that typically fills daytime television with light humor and rehearsed compliments. Instead, the direction of the discussion veered sharply when Joy decided to steer the focus away from the film and onto Julia's private history. Joy opened with a familiar grin that longtime viewers instantly recognized, but her tone carried a sharp edge. She mentioned the movie's theme and then pivoted abruptly to Julia's personal relationships, implying that her life choices might undermine the message of stability portrayed in the film. The other hosts shifted uneasily, their body language revealing discomfort as the conversation drifted into sensitive territory. Whoopi Goldberg cast a cautionary glance toward Joy, silently signaling that the line of questioning might be going too far, yet the momentum had already built. Julia's expression flickered for a split second before she regained her composure. She responded calmly, explaining that her private experiences were distinct from the broader message of supporting women's ambitions and challenges. Her voice was steady, measured, and professional, reflecting years of navigating public scrutiny. However, Joy pressed further, leaning forward with a persistence that suggested she had no intention of changing course. She argued that audiences often blur the line between an actor's real life and the roles they portray, hinting that authenticity mattered more than Julia was willing to admit. A low murmur rippled through the audience as the exchange intensified. What was expected to be a pleasant celebrity interview was evolving into something far more confrontational. One of the co-hosts attempted to redirect the conversation toward Julia's fellow cast members, offering a safer topic, but the interruption was swiftly overridden. Joy continued, raising questions about Julia's past marriages and implying moral contradictions between her on-screen characters and off-screen decisions. Julia's trademark smile faded entirely. Her tone sharpened, carrying a firmness that signaled growing frustration. Brusha, that she had come to discuss a film celebrating solidarity among women, not to defend herself against rumors and insinuations. The tension became visible on every face at the table. The studio lights seemed harsher, the silence between sentences heavier. Joy dismissed Julia's concerns, insisting that public figures must answer for their histories, and describing her comments as factual rather than intrusive. Behind the scenes, producers reportedly gestured frantically, debating whether to cut to a commercial break. The cameras, however, remained fixed, capturing every second of the escalating disagreement. Julia straightened in her chair, gripping the armrests as she spoke about her decades in the industry and the criticism she had endured over the years. She accused Joy of prioritizing sensationalism over substance, suggesting that personal attacks were being used to generate headlines instead of meaningful dialogue. Joy's voice rose in response, defending her approach as legitimate inquiry and implying that celebrities often prefer flattery to accountability. The studio fell into near silence, the audience captivated by the rawness of the exchange. Even crew members paused their duties, watching the scene unfold with rapt attention. Julia's voice lowered, becoming calm but unmistakably intense, a shift that carried more weight than shouting ever could. She questioned whether dismantling someone's character under the guise of an interview truly qualified as journalism, emphasizing the importance of informed and respectful questioning. Joy waved off the criticism, remarking that fame came with scrutiny and that actors were not above difficult conversations. Julia let out a brief, humorless laugh, stating that there was nothing sincere about what was happening and calling the situation a deliberate attempt to embarrass rather than enlighten. The atmosphere thickened as both women stood their ground, neither willing to concede. Joy's expression flushed with irritation, clearly surprised by the force of Julia's rebuttal. She suggested that discomfort with criticism often stemmed from unresolved personal choices, hinting that constant praise had insulated Julia from real challenges. Julia's composure finally began to crack as her voice grew louder. She fired back by questioning why successful women so often became targets and why tearing them down was treated as entertainment. The energy in the studio felt explosive, as if a single additional remark could push the confrontation beyond repair. Joy reacted with visible anger, slamming her hand on the desk hard enough to rattle the coffee mug beside her, the sharp sound echoing across the set as the audience watched in stunned silence. "I've been in this industry for years while you were still serving drinks in Georgia. Don't you dare challenge my honesty or the way I do my job." The sharp remark hung in the air, but Julia remained unexpectedly composed despite the outburst coming from across the table. She drew a slow breath before replying, her tone controlled yet firm. "You've spent the last several minutes trying to humiliate me on live television with personal digs that have nothing to do with why I'm sitting here. If that's what you call honesty, then clearly we operate by completely different principles." Principles? Joy's voice climbed higher, abandoning any remaining sense of professionalism. "That's amusing coming from someone who built a career portraying the nation's sweetheart while acting nothing like that when the cameras are off." Whoopi finally attempted to step in, her voice cautious but urgent as she suggested that everyone pause and reset the tone. Joy cut her off instantly without even turning her head, declaring that she was tired of famous guests arriving with expectations of steering every conversation in their favor. She insisted that the show was meant for real discussion, not polished publicity tours. A spark of anger flashed in Julia's eyes. "A diva? I've been polite since the moment I walked out here. You're the one who decided to corner me with tabloid nonsense instead of discussing the actual project." Joy responded with a dry laugh that carried more bitterness than humor. She dismissed acting as nothing more than dressing up and reciting lines crafted by others, contrasting it with what she described as her own responsibility to ask the hard questions that others supposedly avoided. Julia's voice rose slightly for the first time. There's nothing difficult about repeating gossip. Meaningful questions would focus on the story we're telling, on the realities faced by working mothers, on the struggles women encounter in this business. What you're doing isn't brave. It's simply unkind. The tension around the table thickened. The other hosts looked visibly uneasy, shifting in their chairs and avoiding eye contact. Papers rustled nervously as one of them pretended to review notes while another seemed ready to disappear beneath the desk. Behind the scenes, producers whispered urgently into headsets, clearly aware that the segment was spiraling beyond control yet reluctant to interrupt what had become gripping television. Joy leaned back with a smug expression, crossing her arms as if satisfied with the chaos. She argued that a celebrity's personal choices were fair territory when promoting a film aimed at families. Julia shot back immediately, stating that her private life had no bearing on the movie's message. Then she pivoted, her words cutting sharply as she suggested that if personal histories were suddenly open for examination, perhaps the conversation should include Joy's own record. She questioned how many colleagues had left the show due to a hostile atmosphere and how many guests had chosen never to return after unpleasant experiences. The smirk vanished from Joy's face. She snapped that the interview was supposed to be about Julia, not her. Julia tilted her head slightly, feigning innocence as she asked whether the so-called tough questions only applied when Joy was the one asking them. The room felt suffocating. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing every subtle shift in expression. The audience sat frozen, unable to look away from the confrontation unfolding in front of them. Joy's voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone as she accused Julia of believing her fame made her immune to criticism. "I know." She described her as just another celebrity with a complicated personal history, trying to sell something to the public. The words seemed to snap whatever restraint Julia still held. She rose abruptly from her chair, the scraping sound echoing across the silent studio. Her reply came with visible intensity as she accused Joy of building a reputation on belittling other women and being threatened by anyone who achieved success. Joy stood as well, meeting her gaze across the desk. She dismissed the film as an obvious attempt to stay relevant and predicted it would fade without impact. The insult lingered like a slap. Julia's face drained of color before flushing with anger. So she fired back, listing the achievements she had earned through years of dedication, and insisting that her work had reached more people than Joy's harsh commentary ever would. Joy bristled, defending the program's long history and status, arguing that Julia was simply another star who had benefited from luck and timing. Julia let out a sharp laugh, filled with scorn rather than amusement. She spoke about the effort and persistence that had shaped her career, emphasizing that every award and opportunity had been the result of relentless work rather than chance. She questioned what Joy had gained beyond a reputation for cruelty on daytime television. Around them, the other hosts were openly distressed, signaling desperately toward the control room and whispering to producers who hovered near the edge of the set. Yet the two women at the center of the storm seemed oblivious to everything except each other. Joy lifted a trembling finger, insisting that at least she was genuine and never hid behind a manufactured smile. She claimed that she spoke her mind regardless of discomfort, presenting herself as someone who valued blunt truth over polished appearances, while the studio remained locked in stunned silence. Julia's tone carried open contempt. She said there was nothing genuine about being harsh simply to entertain an audience, and nothing truthful about tearing into people just to inflate one's own importance. She accused Joy of hiding behind a microphone and calling it honesty when it was really intimidation. The word bully seemed to ignite something deep inside Joy. Her expression twisted with anger, and she stepped out from behind the desk, closing the distance between them. She demanded to know how Julia dared label her that way, insisting she was the only one willing to ask questions others avoided while everyone else flattered celebrities. Julia didn't retreat even slightly. If anything, she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a quiet intensity that filled the room more effectively than shouting ever could. She asked what kind of person used a national platform to shame guests for ratings, and what kind of interviewer focused on personal rumors instead of discussing someone's professional achievements. The clash had reached a critical point. Both women stood across the desk from each other, their words cutting through the stunned silence of the studio. Joy's face burned red as Julia's remarks landed. Joy snapped back, accusing Julia of being manipulative and suggesting she had climbed her way to success through calculated relationships, then played the victim when confronted. Julia's eyes narrowed, her response sharp and precise. She questioned whether Joy's claims were grounded in expertise or merely reflections of her own insecurities, implying that the hostility came from a place of personal frustration rather than objective truth. Joy let out a rough, humorless laugh. She said the only discomfort she felt was having to share a stage with someone who acted superior while refusing to address her very public missteps. Julia raised her voice to match the intensity. She argued that her mistakes were lessons that shaped her growth, while Joy's errors were broadcast daily to millions. She described those mistakes as confusing cruelty with journalism and mistaking criticism for significance. Joy slammed her hand against the desk, sending papers and pens scattering. She declared that her importance long predated Julia's fame, that she had been creating meaningful television, while Julia was still hoping for a breakthrough role. Julia responded with a cold laugh devoid of amusement. She said what was happening now was not meaningful broadcasting, but spectacle, comparing the scene to a circus and accusing Joy of choosing gossip over. She pointed out that real conversation would have explored the themes of empowerment in her film, the realities faced by working mothers, or any subject with genuine depth, rather than dissecting personal relationships like a tabloid columnist. The other hosts had all but abandoned attempts to regain control. Whoopi spoke urgently into her earpiece, while the others looked on with expressions of disbelief, as though watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. Producers hovered near the edges of the set, visibly debating whether to cut the feed or continue airing the explosive exchange. Joy's tone grew sharper, insisting that it was meaningful to hold public figures accountable instead of treating them like royalty simply because they were famous. Julia reacted with incredulity, asking what exactly she was supposed to be accountable for. Being human making personal decisions unrelated to her work. She accused Joy of disguising vindictiveness as honesty, arguing that the attacks were driven by personal motives rather than public interest. Joy stepped closer, her face tight with disdain, claiming she was merely being truthful and suggesting Julia wouldn't recognize honesty, even if it confronted her directly. Then she crossed a line that drew an audible gasp from the audience, making a remark about Julia's appearance that shifted the mood from tense to shocked. For a brief second, Julia looked stunned, her mouth slightly open before her expression hardened into something far more controlled and severe. Her voice dropped to a near whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the studio as she asked if Joy had really just chosen to criticize her looks on live television. Joy appeared to realize she had gone too far, yet pride kept her from fully retreating. She attempted to justify the comment by implying that someone who had undergone cosmetic changes shouldn't lecture others about authenticity. The silence that followed was heavy and unbroken. Julia stood motionless, gathering herself. When she finally spoke, her tone was icy and deliberate. She said she had worked with difficult personalities throughout her long career, demanding directors, self-absorbed co-stars, and relentless producers, but had never encountered someone she considered as unprofessional, as deliberately cruel, or as transparently insecure as Joy appeared in that moment. Joy's face flushed a deep shade of purple as she bristled at the accusation. She demanded to know how Julia could label her insecure, insisting that Julia was the one unable to withstand a few challenging questions without unraveling. Riskers without unraveling. The studio remained frozen. Every camera trained on the confrontation as the charged atmosphere refused to ease tough questions. Julia's restraint finally shattered. The calm exterior she had maintained for so long gave way to visible frustration. She leaned forward, her voice rising with sharp intensity as she fired back. "You want something tough? Here's one for you. When you look at yourself tonight, are you actually proud of what you did here? Are you proud that you used your influence to try to embarrass someone who came here to talk about her work? Are you proud that what should have been a discussion about empowering women turned into a personal smear?" Joy's chest rose and fell rapidly, her hands trembling with anger. "The voix." She snapped back, telling Julia not to twist the situation around. She insisted that any guest who stepped onto the set already knew the type of questions that would be asked. Julia immediately countered, saying she had expected professionalism and thoughtful journalism, not what felt like a personal grudge disguised as an interview. She added that the most disappointing part was the lost opportunity to discuss issues that truly mattered to women watching across the country. Instead of focusing on meaningful topics, the conversation had sunk into pettiness and hostility. She said it wasn't journalism at all, just disappointing behavior. The word disappointing seemed to push Joy over the edge. She pointed a shaking finger toward Julia and shouted for her to leave the studio immediately. Julia stared back in disbelief, questioning the claim that it was Joy's studio to control. She argued that the space was meant for genuine dialogue, not a platform for personal attacks. Joy repeated the command even louder, her voice cracking as she called for security to remove Julia from the set. Whoopi finally rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the uproar as she questioned what was happening and reminded Joy that a guest couldn't simply be thrown out. Joy, however, refused to back down, glaring at Julia and declaring she wouldn't sit there and be lectured by someone she considered past her prime. Julia calmly picked up her purse, her movements deliberate and steady, despite the chaos swirling around her. She replied that Joy was right about one thing. She was indeed better than the spectacle unfolding before them and had no intention of participating in it any longer. Two security staff members appeared hesitantly near the edge of the stage, clearly uncertain about whether they were actually meant to intervene. Behind the cameras, producers argued in hushed but urgent tones, torn between ending the escalating scene and recognizing the dramatic television it had become. Joy continued pointing and shouting, telling Julia to run away like she always did when confronted. Julia paused mid-stride and turned back one final time. Her voice was now controlled, steady, and filled with unmistakable disdain. She said she wasn't running. She was choosing not to give the circus any more of her time. There was a difference, she added, even if Joy couldn't see it. Joy shrieked for her not to walk away. insisting she wasn't finished yet. Julia's smile was thin and icy as she answered that she, on the other hand, was completely finished. She added that once viewers saw the exchange, many of them might feel the same way. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, her posture straight and her steps firm against the studio floor. Behind her, Joy continued shouting insults, telling her not to bother returning and claiming the show didn't need guests who couldn't handle direct questioning. Julia stopped near the edge of the set without turning around and called back that real questions required real journalists, suggesting that perhaps one day Joy would understand the distinction. She then continued toward the exit, leaving behind a stunned studio filled with tense silence. The co-hosts sat motionless, and Joy remained standing, still yelling at a chair that was now empty. The cameras kept rolling as she vented her anger, seemingly unaware of how every word was shaping public perception in real time. Whoopi tried repeatedly to calm her, gesturing and speaking urgently, but Joy appeared beyond reason. Eventually, she dropped back into her seat, breathing hard, muttering that the show didn't need people like that anyway. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. She glanced around and noticed the shocked expressions on her fellow hosts and the frantic activity of the production team. The realization slowly dawned that the heated outburst might have been a serious misstep. What was intended to be a simple promotional appearance had spiraled into complete disorder, all of it captured live for millions to witness. Julia had left with her composure intact, while Joy remained surrounded by the aftermath of her own words. The segment became one of those rare moments that overshadowed everything else, a clash that illustrated how quickly a conversation can unravel when restraint disappears and emotions take control.